Afternoon, everybody. I think we are just going to give the subcommittee members another minute to join. It looks like we have a handful of members of the public and guests, but we're sparse on cross-sector members at the moment.
Hello, folks. Sorry to be late.
Hey, Dave. Yeah, we're slow in assembling today. I did just get off the phone with Rich, so I'm hoping our co-chair will be joining. Here he comes.
Hi, Melissa. I was having trouble getting on the line. I hope others aren't having the same trouble.
Maybe we will give it one more minute, but at 5 after, I'd love to kick us off. Here's Liz. All right, we're all right. I think we are going to dive in, and we may get a few other subcommittee members or public partners as we move ahead. But good afternoon, everyone. This is a meeting of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council, the November 14th meeting of the subcommittee. Diving into our agenda, the first order of business is to assign a note taker from the subcommittee. Do we have any volunteers to take notes today? Dave's taken notes before, so he just left. He just walked out of the room. Anyone who has not, and I think most of the folks here have taken notes before, anyone willing to be a note taker today?
I will.
Thank you, Christine, and I know you've done it before. Appreciate your help there. I think we're going to skip our second agenda item, which was to approve the minutes from October 31st. I don't think we actually have a quorum, and I think we can put that off until our next meeting. So moving ahead with reviewing the agenda, and again, to highlight the meeting goal, which the subcommittee has really wanted to put forward, soliciting input from electric utilities, efficiency utilities, and distribution utilities for the subcommittee as we refine our recommendations to advance to the full Climate Council in December. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. If folks could mute, that would be great. Yeah, there we go. Hopefully the feedback issue has been resolved. I think we are a pretty small group, and we do have a new member of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, Matt Coda. So I think if we could just quickly go around the room and invite both members of the subcommittee. We'll do subcommittee introductions first, and then quickly, folks who are joining the meeting, just your name and affiliation would be great. I'd love if we could just do introductions quickly. I'm Melissa Bailey with the Public Service Department, and I co-chair the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, and I'll get over to my co-chair, Rich.
I'm Richard Coward from the RAP and also co-chair. Liz, maybe you're next on my screen.
Sure, I'm Liz Miller. I was appointed by the House as a utility representative, and for this group, I've been working on the electricity task force for this climate plan.
Matt? Welcome.
Thanks. Matt Cota with Meadow Hill, appointed by the Speaker to represent the fuel sector.
Dave?
I'm Dave Farnsworth. I work for RAP. I volunteer in this position on the Climate Council. And Ben, you're next.
Ben Molaski. I'm a thermal energy program specialist at the Department of Public Service, and I'm part of the Buildings and Thermal Task Group. I'll pass it over to Christine.
Christine Donovan, career-long renewable energy consultant, sort of retired, sort of not retired, serving on the cross-sector subcommittee for the second time, and co-authored the thermal section of the initial cap along with Dave Farnsworth last time. Oh, and pass it along to Brian Evans, I guess.
This is Brian Evans Mudgeon. I'm the village manager for the Village of Hyde Park. Thank you. I don't have a list to know who's next.
Hi, I'll go. I'm Andrea Cohen. I am the manager of government affairs and member relations at Vermont Electric Cooperative.
I can go next. Amber Widmer from Burlington Electric Department, the regulatory specialist there.
I can go next. Dave Westman for Efficiency Vermont.
I'll go next. Alec Anzak, Director of Energy and Efficiency Resources at the Public Service Department.
I can go next. Callie Fishburne at the Bennington County Regional Planning Commission, and I'm one of the liaisons from the Just Transition Subcommittee.
Any other utility partners on the line who'd like to do an intro? Bill, go ahead.
Washington Co-op. Hi.
I'm Melissa. This is Warren Coleman. I'm here on behalf of Global Foundries today.
Great. Hi, Warren.
Hello.
Any other public observers or members of the public who would like to do a quick intro?
Annette Smith, Vermonters for a Clean Environment.
Steve Crowley with the South Burlington Energy Committee and Vermont Community Solar.
I'm Bob Amelang. I'm retired from CVPS and GMP.
I'm Laura Cavan Bailey. I'm the Climate Economy Program Manager with the Vermont Council on Rural Development.
Based on my screen, I think we've got almost everybody. There are a couple of people who have not introduced themselves, and that's okay. So, Melissa, back to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks. We made it through the bumpy introductions. Thanks all for joining us today over the lunch hour. Just to give a quick kind of grounding for guest attendees and kind of a refresh for the subcommittee, just kind of level setting where we are in the process. So For folks who are not aware, the Vermont Climate Council is in the process of updating the Climate Action Plan under the Global Warming Solutions Act. The council was established, as well as the specific subcommittees, of which cross-sector mitigation is one. And Global Warming Solutions Act also requires regular updates to Vermont's Climate Action Plan. The initial Climate Action Plan was adopted by the Climate Council in December of 2021, and the next Climate Action Plan is due in July of 2025. So subcommittees have worked over the summer and fall to draft recommendations for possible inclusion in that Climate Action Plan. You'll hear the lingo, pathways, strategies, and actions. They're all collectively recommendations, just with increasing levels of specificity. This specific subcommittee, cross-sector mitigation, is charged with proposing a suite of recommendations that would ensure the state meets its greenhouse gas reduction requirements under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And cross-sector works through three task groups that you've heard referenced during the intros. One task group is focused on buildings and thermal sector. There's the transportation sector task group and the electric sector task group. And so our plan for today, for the remainder of the meeting, will be hearing quick updates, 10 to 15 minutes from each task group around the recommendations they've been developing, and then have some open conversation and feedback from guest attendees on those recommendations. We specifically included the energy efficiency utilities and electric distribution utilities in this meeting because, as folks know, electrification is a key component of Vermont's climate policy. And so recommendations kind of across all of these sectors touch on the electric sector. And we really want to specifically hear from the regulated utilities as we move towards finalizing those recommendations. And again, in terms of timeline, our subcommittee owes recommendations to the Climate Council by mid-December. I believe there's a December 16th council meeting at which we owe kind of our final package of recommendations to the council. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to, I think Buildings and Thermal is up first to present your draft recommendations.
Are you able to hear me okay? You able to hear me, Melissa?
I can hear you. You could be a little louder. You're a little quiet.
Okay, that will do.
Good.
Let me see here. Are you able to see my desktop?
Right now, we're seeing your whole desktop. There you go.
There it goes.
Great. Thanks. And thanks everyone for joining. As Melissa mentioned, this is a work in progress, and we really value your input and getting your insights into the work we're doing. My name is Dave Farnsworth, as I mentioned earlier. And what I'm going to do is talk through parts of this. I'm going to be sharing this with others if they're able to show up on this call. The Buildings Thermal Task Group. This is the list of folks who've been involved in this effort. As Melissa mentioned, our work is structured along these lines: pathways, strategies, and actions. And she put it really nicely. They're all recommendations. They just have to do with relative levels of specificity. And what I'm going to do is, what we've done is sort of split up our work into these four categories: buildings, equipment used in buildings, fuels, and cross-cutting issues. But one thing I want to emphasize before we get rolling here is that those of us working on this look at the Global Warming Solutions Act as requiring us to develop recommendations that are going to ensure that Vermont meets those Solutions Act goals. And many of us, I can't speak for everybody necessarily, but many of us think that one of the things we're going to need to do, this work group's going to need to do, is to develop a broad structural policy that's going to be linked to achieving those goals, that's going to help finance all the various efforts that are going to be required to meet those goals. So in the past, the first plan, of course, the primary recommendation along these lines that came out of that was the clean heat standard. Obviously, that's under discussion these days. Is it going to be something in the alternatives? Is it going to be a cap and invest program? The transportation working group is looking at that for purpose of funding transportation efforts. Is that something that maybe this task group is going to recommend? It's certainly something that we need to look at. There's a New York program going on. There's the Western Climate Initiative program that would allow for economy-wide cap and invest program that would impose goals, recognize different points of meeting those goals, and would help finance meeting those goals. Is it significantly expanding Tier 3? That's another opportunity, another option here. Is it broadening the mandates of the efficiency utilities in this state if these other choices aren't adopted? Is it increasing a tax on delivered fuels that the legislature would then earmark for certain solutions? We don't have an answer to that, but my point here is that we're working to develop a number of different policies along these categories, but we think that an overarching goal and framework is going to be really important to meeting those requirements. So let me talk about buildings and give you a sense of what we're thinking here. So the idea is to improve weatherization, energy efficiency, and take a look at energy and energy codes and standards. The actions we're recommending here are to meet weatherization goals across all sectors. For LMI communities, reducing barriers so they can more readily see their homes weatherized. And of course, securing funding is going to be critical to all of those efforts. Codes and standards, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of possible recommendations that we will push up to the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee, and they include regular updates on building energy standards and commercial building energy standards, developing a sustainable energy code circuit rider initiative. We realize there's one in there, but it's not funded for as much as 2 years, is my understanding. We think that's an important effort to consider. Adopting the Act 47 Building Energy Code Study Committee recommendations. There are a number of recommendations that we think are useful and worth putting forward. Establishing a role for EEUs to play more supporting roles with respect to code compliance and incentives for code compliance. And then there's Act 47 Building Energy Code Study Committee's recommendations regarding EEU's support for meeting net zero level of performance in new building construction. Expanding the use of modern energy efficient mobile homes is really important. A lot of Vermonters live in mobile homes, and developing a policy that recognizes this and improves the ability of Vermonters to get into better homes than maybe they're living in now, we think is important. Act 47 had a mobile home task force, and they had recommendations, and we support those. Increasing and standardizing the efficiency of rental properties is really important. Vermont's housing, very little of it is new buildings, something around 1%, a very small percentage. Vermonters can't afford to buy houses. There's a shortage of houses. So when we think about rental properties, these existing properties, there are a lot of Vermonters who are in the position of having to rent. And we think it's important for the state through legislation to adopt an efficiency standard for rental units. We're recommending a standard that would basically lag about 10 years behind up-to-date standards, but we think that's an important step. Part of that would be amending the definition on 9 VSA of fit for human habitation. That's quickly our recommendations regarding buildings. And if Jared is on the line, he is up for this next round.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, yeah, I'm here. I'll just note that I am just finished presenting at the Vermont Housing Conference, so I am not. I'm outside in a parking lot without Wi-Fi, so hopefully you can hear me. If not, let me know and somebody else can take over. But broadly, as Dave was talking about, we're looking at multiple pathways. The first that he just covered is buildings, and making sure that buildings are more energy efficient to lower energy use, pollution, and costs for Vermonters. This next one is about the equipment that is used in those buildings. And this pathway is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by requiring that newly installed thermal equipment would meet emissions-based equipment standards with some appropriate exemptions in terms of technical feasibility and market maturity. So we know that a number of states, including Maryland and California, are looking at advancing via rule emissions-based equipment standards, either to meet a no greenhouse gas emission standard or a no nitrous oxide NOx standard, and that a number of states are also exploring those. So that's actively under consideration so that we can get to a point where we don't lock in decades more of pollution that we can't afford if we're going to meet our pollution reduction obligations. And also so that we can help from a consumer protection perspective, help avoid Vermonters locking in on high cost, price volatile fossil fuels that keep energy costs higher for longer and less predictable for longer. So those are some of the main things that we are looking at on the equipment side. A greenhouse gas emissions based standard for newly installed equipment, and or a NOx based standard. They would rely on different legal frameworks, one on the Global Warming Solutions Act, the other on the Clean Air Act, but they are both relevant. And then finally, strategy 3 here, the importance of looking at a performance-based approach to ensure that we're lowering the global warming potential of any refrigerants that are used in heat pumps that are sold in Vermont. And that is continuing to be explored with partners at the state and Efficiency Vermont, et cetera. And I think, and so the next piece of this is not just about the equipment itself, but understanding that oftentimes the upfront investment that's necessary to use less polluting equipment that can be less costly over time, that upfront investment can be more. The importance around recommendations to ensure equitable access to beneficial electrification, especially for low and moderate income households. So this involves sustainable funding sources for the incentives or grants around beneficial electrification for LMI households. And it also, we're looking at what consumer protections might be necessary or desirable to ensure that households with low and moderate incomes wouldn't experience any negative consequences from having more of their energy bill on their energy costs on their electricity bill, even if their overall energy costs have the opportunity to go down through electrification. There have been some really good questions that have come up about, even though the Climate Council primarily has the ability to make recommendations at a state level, there are certainly federal programs that we rely on. And sometimes those rules can prove challenging in terms of helping people move to electrification. We've heard a lot about how the LIHEAP program will only provide support for one fuel. And so if somebody's getting LIHEAP assistance or fuel assistance for fuel oil or propane, but they could have a heat pump installed, but their benefit would go down because they're not able to use that for a second fuel source for electricity. Want to look into, even if we can't change that directly, can we make a recommendation that could address some of these unintended consequences and these kind of perverse incentives that may exist that were not contemplated before we thought about the energy transition that's underway now. I think next slide. And so this, again, is focused on equitable access for low and moderate income households, specifically looking at there's a strategy here around the water heater market and wanting to ensure the availability of water heating models of water heaters in Vermont that either have a communications port or an open access communications ability, so that there is the option for customers who would so want that to be controlled by their utility, so that we can avoid the periods of peak demand and therefore reduce costs for all ratepayers through better management of some water heaters. So we're looking at that. And then next, sorry, I'm cognizant of time, so trying to go fairly efficiently. And that, I think, is similar to the last one. Again, focused on water heaters and the utility programs to ensure that those loads can be directly managed or controlled through time differentiated price signals. And I think that is it for the equipment recommendations that we are discussing and looking at.
Thanks, Jared. Ben, I think it's up to you now.
Thanks, Dave. So that brings us to fuels. Obviously, when thinking about the thermal sector, fuels is a key component of meeting greenhouse gas reductions in that sector. So the pathway 4 here really is aimed at reducing GHG emissions from fuels by reducing the carbon intensity of those fuels. And our strategy here, as Dave mentioned at the top of the presentation, there is right now, obviously, the Clean Heat Standard is the current policy proposal on the table that does address fuels by having a declining carbon intensity score requirement built into it. Whether or not that moves forward is up for debate, obviously. But nonetheless, the underlying strategy of that we're thinking here needs to be one that creates a framework for significant emissions reductions, in the fuel sector, thermal sector overall, but fuels specifically need to be addressed in a comprehensive manner that ensures that greenhouse gas emissions from those fuels decline over time. And so again, right now, the current action on the table is the Clean Heat Standard, and we'll see what happens there. So moving on to cross-cutting, really this gets at workforce. Obviously, everyone, regardless of what sector you're in, I think here in Vermont is facing workforce constraints. So a huge piece of the puzzle here to really ensure that we have the workforce moving forward to deliver on, related to thermal sector, we need the workforce to weatherize, to install heat pumps, and advance, fuel switching technology in the sector. So our, strategy and action here is to continue the coordination that's underway to complete the development of the Weatherization Workforce Training Center. Once that is completed, that would be a huge boost toward the goal of increasing the workforce that is available for the thermal sector goals. Next slide, Dave. And our last pathway here, additional cross-cutting pathway, is really aimed at the optimizing really of the GHG emissions reduction requirements from the electric, gas, and energy efficiency utilities. So really the strategy here would be to look at and kind of expand and update the utility performance metrics to include greenhouse gas emissions reductions, so that we can more effectively achieve Vermont's legal requirements through the GWSA. And an action here would be to basically get that ball rolling and start to have the Public Utility Commission, open a case and start to examine consider how those metrics might be integrated into the current policy goals, and see how that and to ensure that there's no unintended consequences from integrating those GHG emissions reduction requirements, so to begin to explore that at that level from the PUC. Yeah, that's where we're at right now for that that strategy in action. So Dave, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ben and Jared, and Melissa, I think we're back to you.
Yeah, thanks, folks, on buildings and thermal. So moving ahead, so we have plenty of time for discussion. I am going to be covering the transportation recommendations. I'm pinch hitting for the transportation task group because those task leads weren't able to join us today, but we do have a couple of members of the transportation task group I know on the phone, so they should feel free to jump in and supplement as I do this quick overview of the pathways, strategies, and actions under consideration by the transportation task group. So quickly we can go forward, Liz. Transportation pathways, we're going to cover 3 and focus really on 1. The intent here is really to highlight the transportation actions that are directly relevant to the utilities. But currently under consideration, you'll see the 3 high-level pathways: reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. This really deals with electrifying our transportation here in Vermont. Pathway 2, reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. The key recommendation there is to establish a clean fuels standard or a low carbon fuel standard for the transportation sector. And then pathway 3, reducing vehicle use and increased travel mode choices. Those recommendations are primarily focused on land use, compact settlement, and alternative modes of transportation. So again, we are going to zero in on pathway 1 here, which largely entails incentives to promote vehicle electrification, and incentives in the form of upfront rebates, rates, and charging infrastructure deployment. And I'll just note the Transportation Task Group has also identified the need for an overarching policy or regulatory solution to ensure pollution reductions and raise consistent revenue, such as participating in a cap and invest program, but that is under study currently. Again, I'll give the same caveat Dave did. These are in draft form, although we are looking to finalize over the coming month. These recommendations, again, are due to the council about a month from now. So let's see, reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. One subset of actions under consideration really are around supporting the purchase of electric vehicles, expanding and ensuring funding for essentially the state rebate programs. As some folks may be aware, previously funded incentives provided by the state, funded through the general fund, essentially ran out of money earlier this year. So looking at continued funding to help defray the upfront cost of purchasing electric vehicles. Under consideration is implementing a vehicle efficiency price adjuster applied to the purchase and use tax stage, excuse me. Essentially, what that looks like is a higher cost tax on less efficient vehicles as an incentive for purchasing more efficient vehicles. Implementing a high mileage user incentive program, so really looking at targeting electric vehicle incentives to those who drive the most. And then another potential recommendation is, to what extent do we as a state strive for consistent EV incentives across utilities? And this would be speaking to specifically the Tier 3 programs. So we can move ahead. So this next bucket of actions deal with electric vehicle rates. Again, you'll see again, leaning on the distribution utilities, encouraging your customers to participate in managed charging programs. And, how do we, one segment that's been identified as an underserved segment, of course, is renters living in multifamily units. So can utilities come up with unique strategies, innovative strategies to essentially reach that target demographic? And potentially looking to increase participation in managed charging programs. So what percentage of electric vehicle drivers are participating in those programs? And should we be looking at setting targets and increasing uptake for EV rates? And a related concept would be exploring opt-in versus opt-out for participation in EV rate programs. And then again, here you'll see a consistent theme. Should the state be aiming for consistent EV rates across utility territories? Is that a component of, equity and access? And then final slide, I think, related to electric vehicle supply infrastructure and the deployment of EV charging should essentially, how are utilities addressing the costs of connecting EVSE in their service territories? How do we get charging infrastructure in underserved areas, specifically rural areas? Should we be looking at how utilities invest in owned charging infrastructure, and does that go into the rate base? Extending time of use rates or managed peak off-peak rates to public charging facilities, and looking at the challenges around demand charges and how they make the economic case for electric vehicle charging infrastructure more challenging, and should we be looking at ways to mitigate those challenges? And then I think the last slide is a set of questions, and we'll come back to this during group discussion. We can put the questions back up, but really, looking again from our utility partners, kind of what are you all seeing on the ground? What's missing from these recommendations? What additional considerations should we be thinking about? And barriers and challenges that you all are facing. And then, of course, the question of funding just looms large across all of our task groups. I'll leave it there. How do we fund these necessary programs that we see as part of the Climate Action Plan? And we really welcome thoughts and comments on that topic. So I think that covers the transportation overview. We'll put the bit about staying involved up again later for folks. But at this point, I think turn over to the electric task group. And Liz, I don't know if there's anything you all want to add before we open it up to public comment.
We didn't specifically talk about who would present, but without even slides, I can do the slides that you already have, Melissa, from a prior meeting if you want. But I would want to just point out for everybody joining us that from a mitigation point of view, the very first pathway that was discussed in the last plan was moving toward 100% clean or renewable standard. And while there will be years of implementation and checkbacks and all of that in the law that was passed, the next plan will acknowledge that in the amendments to the res from last session are a part of that prior pathway. And so potentially complementary actions may be discussed in the Climate Action Plan, but that particular pathway from a mitigation point of view was identified as both important from the prior plan and a solution created in the meantime with a path for check-ins. The other two pathways were also ones that can continue to be supported. And the question really is whether there are any updates that are needed. And just briefly, they were continuing to provide financial and technical assistance to Vermonters as they upgrade their electric service and install equipment. And we've noted the work that's already underway there regarding both the PUC's work on electric vehicle service installation and the docket that they have open on that, as well as some of the federal funding for home electric system upgrades through a grant program, among others. And then the third pathway, just to say it quickly, is continued support and enablement of load management and grid optimization, which is largely a DU function and work that is already going on there. So whether or not there will be additional recommendations there beyond encouraging deployment of those solutions hasn't really been landed on yet. And, I think the point of today's conversation is to talk about what else the utilities feel they may need in order to support that work that they're doing. Whereas some of the recommendations from the other subgroups sort of have been developed to potentially put programs or additional obligations on the utilities. So I think probably focusing on those is going to make the most sense. But I'm happy to hear Rich and anyone else who's on those the electric task group. I'll stop there in case they want to add anything on those topics.
Thanks, Liz. I think that's fine. I'm sure others will have plenty to say, and as I agree with you that a lot of the conversation today should focus on the recommendations that we've heard from the other task groups. All right, then. Anything further, any follow-on comments, things you want to add from those who have presented thus far? Then I think I'd like to kick it open to comments, questions from members of the public who are visiting with us today. We really want to hear your questions. We want to hear your comments. And if we have time, we can engage in some, answer some questions that you may have. Members of the task groups may be able to answer in real time some of those questions. We'll see how much time we have. I'll just call on people if you put your hands up. Annette.
Yes, I just wanted to flag one thing, and that is on demand response and controlling people's appliances. I'd like those of you who are developing these recommendations to keep in mind that Vermont has an opt-out program for smart meters, and the reason is because some people are very sensitive to the radio frequency radiation, the Wi-Fi, and so it's really important that that's recognized and acknowledged, and that there is an option for either opting out or making sure that those features can be turned off from appliances. And overall, I think I've made this comment before. I hope that all of the recommendations will have some sort of a cost-benefit analysis associated with them, so that when they do go to the legislature, that there is some developed information so that they're not just starting from scratch. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Dave Farnsworth. I just wanted to note that what we're proposing is a voluntary tariff for purposes of heat pump demand response. That is a tariff that's available to folks who want to take advantage of it. Nobody's being required to participate.
Right. It's just important that the technology is such that it can be, that option can be turned off.
Thanks. Brian.
Trying to find my mute button. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Evans-Mungen. I am the village manager for the Village of Hyde Park, who also I administer the electric utility here for Hyde Park. This is the first opportunity that I've had a chance to participate in this conversation, and I very much appreciate the dialogue that has been presented so far today. Just a few observations as I've taken some notes during the presentations. I think, first of all, David, I was very glad to hear the voluntary nature of the water heater effort, because I think that goes to one of the crux of the positions that Hyde Park has, in that all DUs are not the same. For example, within Hyde Park, we actually have a very residential nature to the construct of our customer base. Approximately 85 to 88% of our customers are residential customers. That induces a number of problems when it comes to taking a look at a variety of the implementation of these programs. When you have such a high percentage of residential, first of all, a lot of other utilities have the ability to spread these costs out over commercial and industrial accounts. Something like, we don't have that necessarily in Hyde Park. So that creates a huge cost burden on the residential consumers within our utility. Plus, when you take a look at Hyde Park, our income levels run the spectrum. And we have already heard from a number of our customers concerns about cross-subsidization between income classes. And that has waged itself into some of the dynamics for what we're taking a look at relative to program designs that we look to implement going forward. So these dynamics are playing a huge role in for us to try to figure out how we're going to be able to address some of these regulatory requirements that are being proposed, discussed, and enacted. So we bring that to your attention, because in the area of sustainable funding, it becomes very difficult that when you're dealing with high percentages of residential versus commercial industrial, or you're taking a look at broad spectrums and healthy percentages of low income versus high income. And the high income folks are the people that are able to take advantage of these programs. And that creates cross-subsidization issues on the low impact or the low income folks to carry those costs when those things kick in. It creates a very substantive burden that has to be picked up. And, that's a matter of something that we're taking a look at. Additionally, when we take a look at the water heater program or other such demand management resources, we take a look at the fact that Hyde Park today does not have smart metering at all. We've taken a look at the cost of smart metering, and the current prices that we have for 1,400 electric meters has a projected cost, installation cost, and first year operating costs of $600,000. $600,000 even on an amortization schedule spread out over a multi-year cycle on 1,400 customers still makes smart metering prohibitively expensive. And without some sort of sustainable funding that would help offset those costs, it becomes very problematic for a utility like Hyde Park to take a look at implementation of such type of smart metering applications. And a lot of these programs that we're talking about, whether it be EV or water heaters or demand response, where they are TOU driven type of experiments, not having smart metering prohibits the ability to be able to do that. And trying to administer those type of opportunities on a KWH only meter becomes problematic. So we want to make sure that you are aware of that, and that's included in the discussions for what you're taking a look at. And then lastly, I just wanted to emphasize that Hyde Park is in the process of developing EV and EVSE tariffs. We have a due date of June of 26 in order to be able to do that. But one of the things that we've already found relative to taking a look at EVSE is not only the items that you mentioned relative to the institutional costs and the infrastructure costs associated with being able to support EV and EVSE installations. You also have to take a look at the fact that there are maintenance requirements, there are repair requirements, and of course, there's also the right now, the nature of EVSE is drawing a lot of attention toward vandalism. And the carrying costs associated with dealing with maintenance, repairs, and vandalism, makes that, especially in the level 2 chargers, prohibitively expensive for the utilities to take on that experience. So these are some of the things that we've taken a look at and that we've seen. We're not saying no, but we just need to be able to make sure that if this is going to be able to be done, it needs to be sustainable and affordable. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Steve Crowley and then Andrea Cohen.
Hi there. In my camera right here. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I just have a few comments, and I guess I'm almost going to leave them in bullet form. They each could have longer discussion, but let me just raise a few points. First, with regard to charging infrastructure, this is something we've talked a lot about in our South Burlington Energy Committee. We tried to institute some ordinances with regard to that. A couple of things have come up. One that I didn't hear mentioned is, you know, when you look out over the next 10 or 15 years as we increase our renewable generation in state, it's very likely, most likely, that's going to mean a huge surplus of, at that point, very low cost power. And it seems likely that we would want to be shifting from charging at home overnight to using that afternoon sun. And that is a complex transition. And I'm not sure anybody's really figured out how to make that transition. I don't have any ideas. It just seems complicated to me with the number of changes in technology and everything that are involved with that. And that seems like that should be on everybody's radar. A second point about charging, particularly for you know, just charging on you know, parking lots and streets and not home charging. If that is done through commercial third-party chargers, those are typically quite a bit more expensive than your home charging rates. And the transition at first, you know, you know, you can do the math and say it's cheaper to go with an EV with that kind of charging infrastructure. But in the long run, it's really inequitable. If people, and this is roughly real numbers that I've seen, is that it's very likely that people who are using that charging infrastructure will be paying 50% more than those who do at home. And if those are low-income folks who are doing that, people in multifamilies or renters, that's highly inequitable. And really that, I'm not sure how to address that, but it's, to me, it's some kind of a challenge for us because it creates an enormous inequity in ability to you know, charge your car. And you know, before long, we're all going to be facing that. So I think that should be dealt with. A few things related to the electric sector specifically. One, again, if we're looking at going to 20%, and if the you know, that's 20% of an increased load in the first place, you know, maybe if it were just 20%, it would be 4 times what we're currently deploying. If you add in the increased overall use of electricity, maybe it's 6 or 7 or 8 times as much solar, et cetera, as we have right now. Siting is going to be an enormous challenge. So it seems like that should be addressed. I don't have the answers for you, but maybe you can in the CAP. I think it should be in there. It should be called out, it seems. Part of that, it seems like with the passage of the new RES requirements, Act 174, the municipal energy planning and regional energy planning, seems outdated somewhat. And I would strongly suggest that that be revised to reflect the RES requirements as opposed to just the greenhouse gas reduction requirements that are currently in that planning law. And, you know, so as communities come up with their deadlines for revising their plans every several years, seems like that new requirement ought to kick in. Another element that I didn't hear about, but I think would be really valuable around the state is space for community solar. I know that you know, net metering, group net metering, offsite group net metering is out of favor and not likely to come back, but there really ought to be some substitute for that. That does not, in my view, it would be better if it did not put a burden on other ratepayers. But you know, something like 2/3 of Vermonters, not just low-income Vermonters, do not have access on their rooftop or site for on-site for solar. And so that opportunity really ought to be figured out. And then my last point would be, I also didn't hear anything mentioned in the electric sector about grid planning, evolution of the grid, whether it's direct grid enhancements or the role of energy storage in the system and other other related opportunities. It seems like that should be part of this plan as well, because that's an essential part of going into that more using lower carbon, especially with that 6 or 8 times as much solar deployed around the state. That those challenges are going to be very real. So seems like if that's not addressed in the cap, that's a big gap. So those are my thoughts for the moment. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to ask the members of the committee, who, particularly those who presented, to be thinking about any responses or dialogue you'd like to have, to answer any of the questions raised by any of the participants speaking today. So just keep that in mind. You'll get an opportunity in a minute. Andrea Cohen.
Afternoon. Hi, thank you for having us in today. I have just a page of some notes from the slides that I was able to see, and then there were some other issues brought up today that I'm happy to circle back or answer questions or get to our experts to get back to you on. For those of you who don't know Vermont Electric Co-op, we're the second largest utility in the state. We cover the northern part of the state. From the islands over to New Hampshire, up to the Canadian border, with some carve-outs for some municipal utilities. VEC has committed to 100% carbon-free power supply starting in 2023, and we're very committed to that. We're also very committed and actively working on our beneficial electrification programs, our Tier 3 programs, our load management programs, and our focus is on doing it in a way that's appropriate and effective in our very rural and relatively low-income service territory. And I will share that we've learned a lot by actually, on the ground implementing these programs. And so as you're considering your recommendations, we want to infuse some of this experience and reality into some of your work and your challenges. And some of the things that I'd say at the high level that are most important for any programs, new programs that we're doing and that we've learned is we've got to keep the lights on. The reliability, you can't convince someone to drive electric or heat electric if we can't have reliable service. And following from that is also making sure it's cost effective and affordable. So those are always our number one priorities. As we go into any new program, that's the most important thing. And then following from that, what we've learned from Tier 3 is the upfront incentives are by far and away the most effective to drive uptake. We'll talk a little more about rate design and rates. It's interesting, and I understand how we sometimes go there is like thinking that's going to be a big motivator. Our experience is it's not, and I'll share a little more. Not to say that it's bad ideas, it's just it's not what's going to move the needle on uptake of products and services. For example, we survey our members every year. And we asked last few years about why aren't you driving electric vehicles? Tell us, what are the barriers for those of you who are not driving electric? The cost of charging is not the barrier. So when we talk about let's do more rate design, about that only 1.5% of the respondents said that the cost of charging is like maybe a barrier. What is the big barrier is, and you probably know this, of course, is the cost of buying the vehicle and charging that vehicle, battery, both the battery range and the availability of charging. So as you're prioritizing in the work you're doing, I'd say focus on vehicle incentives, focus on charging infrastructure. Do not focus on rate design. That is not the priority. It's fine, it's fair, but it's not making the real difference. and as a matter of fact, as you were talking about water heater rate design, and there, my first reaction was maybe you should survey Vermonters before you really, mandate anything. I just heard it was voluntary, but if there was some kind of idea of doing a mandate on the utilities to implement this, I'd say first talk to people and see if it would even make any kind of difference, because we have a lot on our plate. And if we were required, like, go rate design for that and do it and make sure it gets done and, redo your bills and redo your rate, that takes a lot of time. And I just want to say, for, making sure it's strategic use of time, we'd much rather be spending our time on, helping people, with their systems and some of the things they're doing. So back to like low income programs, low and moderate income programs. Again, upfront incentives, we've learned, will make the greatest difference, like the trying to find funding for those EV incentives that recently ran out. Helping people pay their bills is always on our mind. And we have a real preference for things that, just bill assistance. And you've seen a lot of different programs like telecom and other kind of fuel assistance, folks that income qualify, helping them pay their bills, in our minds, is the most simplest and most direct way to help people. And there's some models for that. And I'll just note, the PUC has been tasked through S305 last year. They'll come back next year this time with a report regarding how to support low and moderate income households with paying their electric bills, how to reduce their energy burden. So I would say maybe you can reference that or look at that, and that could be part of your recommendations. Uniform EV rates is something I think that requires a little more, little diving into. The cost of delivering electricity is complex and depends on a whole bunch of factors. In a rural service territory, it costs us more to get power to our members' homes than it does in a more dense place. That's just the nature of the beast. And if we were going to charge less to certain members who might drive EVs, for example, by definition, we're like cost shifting that to other VEC co-op members who might not be in the financial position to pay more. Anywhere you draw the line, there's someone just over the line that said, oops, I can't afford my bill now. Now it's going to be more expensive, especially in things like EVs or those types of products, where we'll probably be cost shifting to people who can least afford it. It happens a lot. I mentioned the water heaters. It's my last point, unless there are questions. I checked in with my team today because I saw such an emphasis on the water heaters here, and our subject matter experts on this thought, well, that needs a lot more exploration. We have been looking at this, and we have found that these heat pump water heaters are so efficient that the value back from operating like load management programs is really not significant in any way. We're also concerned it could harm the efficiency by shifting, preheating, things like that might actually do some harm versus good. We have not yet come up with a good program design for water heater load management at this time. So we would recommend that's something that, talk to us and some of the other utilities more about, because there's some interesting work going on, and we're learning a lot on that as well. So last quote, somebody was talking about system digging into, making sure our system can support all the electrification. And I'll just note that we are required to do what's called an IRP. I'm sure many of you know about that. We really dive in deep on future load needs, storage, system infrastructure. Like, there's a lot of work going on in that space. So again, maybe you reference the IRPs and the work going on there in your work. And I'll stay on as you discuss things in case there's questions.
Jared, I see your hand up. By the way, thanks to all the speakers for all those observations and suggestions. We've been making quite a list.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments that were shared. I did want to ask a specific follow-up question, if it's okay, Andrea, to put you on the spot. Going back to the beginning of your comments, I really appreciated what you said about, first and foremost is the importance around reliability. And I wanted to mention one of the conversation topics that has come up in the transportation task group, to see if you at VEC or some of the other utilities or anybody else on the call would have thoughts about this topic that was not covered in the transportation slide deck that Melissa shared, but has come up as a discussion topic. And that is addressing the challenge of the number of public EV chargers, both level 2 and DC fast chargers, that are often down and inoperable and in need of maintenance. I know that for a lot of EV drivers, it is the number one frustration is, pulling up to a charger that's offline or that is having some issue. And I know my understanding is that for state grants related to EV supply equipment, EVSE, or just generally charging infrastructure, if we want to use that term, that there is a requirement on, I believe it's about 5 years of making sure that they are maintained and fully operational. But it seems like there's this other question about a lot of existing chargers, especially those that were funded with, funds from the settlement with regard to the Volkswagen emissions cheating scandal. There is this question: what can be done to ensure that charging infrastructure that is installed is maintained and operational? I know that a lot of that is owned and managed by third parties. Some of the questions that have come up: is there something around extended producer responsibility, where the folks who are installing those chargers are responsible for maintaining them? Anyway, we don't necessarily have an answer yet, but we know that there's a challenge there. And it was clear that it related to some of the reliability comments you made at the beginning, Andrea. So I was curious if you have insight on that, or if anyone else would like to provide input on that topic.
I'll share just a few things that are kind of related, but not exactly on point, because I don't really know how you make sure that folks that have especially gotten the state funds, will continue to be responsible. It sounds like it needs to, I don't know if there needs to be some contingency or some payback, like some financial responsibility. I will just add, before I let somebody else answer who's, more on point with that, another part of something that's been frustrating to us is folks that have gotten public dollars to install charging stations, public charging. There's no rate regulation associated with that. So that we have found a little frustrating. Like, we have a few chargers at our facilities that are public, and, we just pay what it cost us to run them. But that doesn't seem to be the case with some of the public ones that were publicly financed. So that's a little, just to make a note on that.
If I may.
Sorry, Brian,
Richard.
you're next up, and then Dave Farnsworth.
Great. Jared, thank you for asking the question. It goes to one of the points that I brought up during my comments. We have seen, and we've talked to a number of public power utilities across the country who have seen that question. And basically the nature is that unless there's cost implications associated with the third party entities, there is no motivation for them to continue to commit on keeping that equipment working. If there are, mechanisms that, can be adopted or employed, in order to, I'm going to use the word penalize those third parties for not maintaining that equipment, then, they're not going to do anything, because they got what they wanted. They got their free money. They put the thing in
Yep.
place. If it stopped working, oh, gee, that's too bad. You know, chances are, as far as the kilowatt hour rate that they were, paying, it's a mechanism that there's no markup, there's no incentive. If there's if, for example, the mechanism had a demand component, so the entity actually had to pay something in order to be able to keep it operational or keep it in play. These are the types of things where you've got to take a look at both sides of the equation to figure out how do you incentivize them to keep the effort up for what they committed to in the first place. And I think, one of the comments that I think Andrea made is, entities who have gotten grant money to do this, if there is no penalty on them to have to pay that back, if they're not performing for a certain amount of time, then there's, again, no incentive for them to do anything. So I think we have to take a look at, how, non-compliance, as I'll call it, is going to be recognized and dealt with.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brian and Andrea. That's really helpful.
Over to you, Dave.
Thank you. Andrea, I want to thank you for raising the point about water heaters. I agree with you entirely that that heat pump water heaters aren't really capable of being effectively managed. You can't toggle them on and off and get the savings that we're talking about. I don't think that is the case, however, with electric resistance water heaters. Those are potential really good sources for demand management. My question for you is how is your electricity supplied? In the Midwest, co-ops are supplied by generation and transmission co-ops. Retail co-ops are subject to demand charges, and they benefit. And they've been doing this for decades. They've been managing their water heating load. Originally, it was to arbitrage cheap coal-fired power versus more expensive coal-fired power. You can heat the water in the middle of the night, and it doesn't matter when you take your shower whether it was heated on peak or off peak, right? But I'm curious how you're supplied electricity and whether or not you think that that there are incentives in place for you to keep your peaks down and lower your capacity costs.
Our power supply is, publicly available. It's a little different than the Midwest or the Southern coast. We're just like any Vermont utility in terms of how we do power supply. Our team that looks at all kinds of load management are looking at, all kinds of every product, and we're doing load management programs now, and they have been looking at water heaters and haven't yet found the value, but if you'd love to, we'd love to meet with you if you have some ideas, because they've been digging into it, and we're happy to do any program that'll bring some value to, reduce peaks. Like we're all about it. And we do have the capability through smart meters and we're doing load management now. So it's just that one hasn't yet, peaked for us as an opportunity. But if you have ideas, we're totally open to hearing them, because we're digging deep into all of these programs.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd love to follow up the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Dave Westman.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I had the opportunity to participate in the thermal task group recommendations a couple of weeks ago, and this is the first time that I saw any of the transportation related comments, so I'll probably just keep my comments focused to that, although I would be curious, because I do see a couple members who are on the thermal task force, if there's any update on changes that have been made since that last presentation on the specific to the thermal sector. Listening to Andrea and others' comments, I don't think I have anything particularly unique to say from the regulated utility perspective, but as a member of the Vermont System Planning Committee, we have been following very closely the development of the Velco long range forecast. And the topic that is rising is that when you use various policy-based projections for greenhouse gas reductions from the transportation sector and expected high case scenarios of electric vehicle growth, for the first time in a long time, we actually start seeing pretty significant cost increases in the transmission system, not just the RNS charge, not just peaks occurring at different times of day, although those are there, but actual transmission related, sub-transmission related costs. And so the VSPC is very actively looking into that and how those costs can both be either deferred or peaks managed, but it kind of all boils down to a form of direct load control for electric vehicles and cold climate heat pumps. And so there's based on that long-term forecast, a general recognition that if we're going to avoid long-term costs in our electric system in order to achieve the policy objectives that are articulated here, then we're going to need to control these devices. And so it's in our mind, it's not an issue of first you do one, then you do the next. It's really something that you need to build these systems at the same time. So my personal opinion is that rates don't get you there alone. And I completely agree with what Andrea said about, it's probably not the rates anyways. That's not the barrier for vehicle adoption. That's not where we're at. But in case it hasn't been discussed in the committee, I thought it was worth mentioning that seems like if we're going to meet these policy objectives, it's going to cause cost increases elsewhere in the system, and there are ways to avoid it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Do you think it would be possible for the task group or for the subcommittee as a whole to see the cost estimates that Velco is developing and the degree to which more active load management could reduce costs on the Velco system or on subtransmission?
A lot of the Velco costs have already been presented to the Public Utility Commission as part of their release of that long-term plan. So there's public information out there about specific projects that would be triggered based on both time and load growth conditions. So some of those costs are out there. The effect and the mechanisms by which you would achieve direct load control on either of these devices, principally identified here, again, EVs and heat pumps, and also recognizing that it did not include heat pump water heaters for the reasons that Andrea definitely articulated correctly. That's our understanding of it as well. That those manners of direct load control are very much a work in progress. They are subject to a lot of technology shifts and a lot of needed investment in the state. Individual utilities are not always in a position to make sizable investments in direct load control themselves, although it's being explored, and we're exploring that as Team Vermont. All of the regulated utilities and the department and Velco are working on it as a solution, but we don't have any of those solutions or their costs identified yet.
Okay, thank you. And Dave Farnsworth put in the chat a request for, a site. I'm sure the department has all of this, and it's publicly available, so I know we can get it. It's just you might be able to direct us.
I just had a question for Dave. At what point did you see the EV growth affecting transmission that you referred to? Is this something you see happening in the next year, next 5 years?
I think that's a great question for Velco. It's also based on once we actually see the growth curve in these transmission, in these transportation transitions actually materializing. As I understand it, the Velco assumption is that if electric vehicles and heat pumps combined grow at the pace that essentially the policy objectives would need them to, it's a 10-year type problem until we start seeing pretty significant load constraints in the northern Vermont region, and then it works its way south over time. So we're looking at roughly 5 years to see if we're on path for that load growth, and 10 years where if that high growth scenario happens, that we would start seeing the issue. And I'm doing that off of memory, Dave. So I'm sure the actual presentations and results from Velco would get into it. I'll see if I can dig up a link too. I mean, there should be several resources out there.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yep.
Any other comments from participants? And then I'll ask members of the subcommittee whether they have more in the way of responses or dialogue. All right, I see no hands. Any further comments, replies, questions from members of the subcommittee? Jared?
I don't have the Velco long range transmission plan study or numbers right in front of me now, but I appreciate Dave's comment. One thing that I would encourage us to consider when we look at that is that my recollection is that a number of those forecasts were based on a conservative assumption around a lack of load management and that strategies that we know are actually already in place. And I don't want to put Liz on the spot, but I believe that she and Green Mountain Power and other utilities have looked at those assumptions. And we do know that many Vermonters are taking advantage of managed charging rates, EV rates. And so that, I think we just need to be careful to look at scenarios that are a kind of conservative worst case scenario without any load management or, work around avoiding periods of peak use versus a scenario in which we continue utilizing and building on proven load management strategies that do exist and are available to us. So I just want to say, I agree that Dave's flag and concern is important. It's warranted, but my recollection is that there were different scenarios, and the ones that were the most concerning were ones that used conservative assumptions that did not account for load management strategies that exist and that can be even more fully deployed.
Can I just respond? I agree with Jared's assessment. The intent of that worst case scenario is essentially, as we confirmed with our questions and answers with Velco, is that if you don't control the load, these will be the costs that occur. Therefore, if you make investments to avoid those costs, then you have the basis of a cost benefit analysis.
Yep.
And so the intent is to not assume that business as usual will eliminate the need for those infrastructure investments. It's precisely to inform the decision making of today, to make the investments based on a cost benefit analysis. And so that would be my recommendation to consider here, is that if we know that those infrastructure costs are going to occur if we achieve our policy objectives, the state will also need to make decisions around investing in those in mechanisms to avoid those costs. And whether that's existing regulatory processes through things like the Vermont System Planning Committee or otherwise is what I'm raising for this discussion.
Thanks, Dave. Any further replies or questions from members of the committee? And so we're getting.
I'm just going to ask if.
You want to put it in the chat, Christine? While Christine's typing, Ben.
I just wanted to respond to Dave Westman. He had mentioned or asked if the thermal group had considered any of the feedback that we had received in the public engagement session a couple weeks back. And I just wanted to say that we did receive quite a bit of feedback, but I'm looking back through my notes, we actually have incorporated or was kind of already incorporated in some of the strategies and actions we had. We did receive some feedback regarding, responsible refrigerant management. So that would be, we are working on addressing that in our strategy 2 or pathway 2 rather, the strategies around that. And then we did receive some feedback from some of the folks working in the weatherization assistance program regarding LIHEAP concerns that only covers, one fuel source. I think that was mentioned, I think by Dave earlier. So we are pursuing that and just, talking with some folks that might be able to advise us further on that issue. And then also, we did hear some concern that, not all the entire housing stock can really adopt easily, heat pump technology, including heat pump water heaters, as well as cold climate heat pumps. And specifically referring to mobile homes. Again, kind of an LMI equity issue there. So we are, I think Dave, or maybe it was, I believe it was Dave, presented on a new strategy that we have to encourage, increased investment in the replacement of mobile homes that might be beyond repair or that would be able to adopt, cleaner technology such as heat pumps. So just wanted to throw that out there that we are, taking some of that feedback into consideration.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Christine, I'll stay on. We can have that conversation. Anything further that our guests would like to say to the committee or questions you want to ask us before we call this meeting to a close? Melissa, we also have some internal business to discuss about next week's meeting, correct?
Yeah, if there aren't additional comments, we can move into the logistics for planning our remaining meetings for the year.
Is there someone who needs to mute a phone because we're back having this echo problem? Let me ask if, is there an echo when I'm speaking? No. Okay, it's just Melissa and Christine so far. All right, why don't we discuss how to move forward from here with the work of the subcommittee? We had been talking about having an in-person meeting, and maybe Jane, you can remind us of that on December 5, is that right?
Happy to, but I think you guys probably have it well in hand, but I think it's the Thursday after Thanksgiving. I reserved a room for you all at National Life.
Okay, so, and we have a subcommittee meeting planned for next week. at our usual time. But Melissa and I were speaking earlier today and thinking that it seemed like it would be more productive to use that time for the task groups to meet and further develop the strategies that everybody's working on. And in other words, instead of getting together as a full subcommittee, instead use the scheduled time to get together in the task groups. And so I'm putting it out there to members of the committee. Would you rather do that, or do you think we need to meet at this point in full committee? Jared?
I mean, working backwards from the Climate Council meeting, the agendas for which were discussed at this morning's steering committee meeting, I think we need to be prepared to share two things. One is the recommendations coming out of the cross-sector subcommittee, but then the second is the highest priority recommendations. And so it feels like between now and then, we've got to finish our list of recommendations and then get them into the format so that they can be shared. But then we also have to go through the exercise of identifying the highest priority recommendations that we want to lift up for consideration. And to me, it's an open question. Do we do that as a subcommittee, or do we say to each of the task groups, in terms of the criteria for prioritization, do we ask those task groups to lift up to the committee, some number of priority actions in addition to a completed list of recommendations, or do we wait and do that in the subcommittee? I think what I would lean towards, if we are going to have the next bit of time focused on task groups rather than a full subcommittee, would be let's finish the list of the recommendations and let's do a straw poll so that we can get an initial sense of where people are at around prioritization, so that we're then ready to lift that up to the full subcommittee and then discuss that in the council meeting.
All right, thank you. Melissa, I'm going to suggest that we do that next week's meeting is be devoted to the task groups meeting individually, and that we then also ask the task groups to go through a prioritization process in order to, begin that process of identifying their highest priorities and what they want to lift up to the full subcommittee, which we could then discuss on December 5. And we'll hopefully, it'll probably be a hybrid meeting, but some of us will be able to be together in person. And then the subcommittee as a whole can address prioritization and try to get ourselves in line to make a recommendation to the council. We will still have a meeting, correct me if I'm wrong, but we'll still have another meeting to put finishing touches on that conversation on December 12th, or in that week.
Yeah, that's right. Rich, am I still echoey?
No, you're good.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, and just to flag, I agree with the proposal and think that makes sense to give the task groups a little extra time. And just to highlight and remind folks, we need to get those recommendations into the template that ANR has developed and is consistent, I think, with last year's recommendations. So that's one of the deliverables that Jared alluded to that we owe to the council. So ideally, we would have, the full list in the template form, as well as task group prioritization. And the full list would get presented to cross-sector. Cross-sector will have an opportunity to weigh in on prioritization and either be consistent with the task groups or potentially advocate for a different prioritization. Again, for that December 5th meeting, which everybody should have on their calendar, and it's been extended to 4 hours. And as Jane said, ANR is able to host people who can come together in person. And then the final note on that meeting, in case the subcommittee isn't aware, is David Plum will be facilitating that for us. So hopefully we can get up through all three task group recommendations and essentially make some significant progress on our prioritization. And then, as Rich said, we do have that meeting on December 12th to tie up loose ends with the whole package going to the council on the 16th.
Okay. Yeah, and I think in addition to sort of, as you say, tying up loose ends, we may on that in those final two meetings want to discuss framing all of our work in a way that will be useful for the entire mitigation obligation portion of the climate action plan. Are any other, so that's the plan going forward. Any other comments, final comments anybody wants to make on this meeting? All right, let me thank our guests. I think you've proven that this kind of meeting is really valuable. Your comments are really useful. And thank you for showing up and sharing your thoughts with us. And thanks to the committee members again for your work. And I believe we can adjourn now.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.